There is a dam in northern Italy which stands tall over a beautiful valley below. You can still walk across it as part of official tours, but it no longer holds back any water and it hasn't produced any electricity for decades. Even though its structure stands perfectly fine, it was once the epicenter for one of the biggest dam disasters in modern history. This is the story of the Vajont Dam. A story about what happens when nature gives clear warnings, but people then fail to interpret or listen to them. Back in the 1950s, Italy was racing forward. The Second World War had left deep scars all across cities and the countryside, but that was now being followed by rapid rebuilding, and the country was gripped by the optimism of post-war reconstruction, as well as the economic boom that would later be called the Italian miracle. Factories reopened, roads expanded, and homes soon filled with appliances that were once considered luxuries, and that all meant that the demand for electricity now surged. Power generation was no longer just about lighting the streets. No, it meant industrial production, economic recovery, and very literally a modern future for everyone. Hydroelectric power was seen as the perfect solution to fuel the country's post-war industrialization efforts because it was domestic, reliable, and Italy's mountainous terrain offered vast opportunities for expansion, innovation, and further growth. Not too different from my home country of Sweden, actually. One of the companies at the forefront of this was Società Adriatica di Elettricità, or SADE. This was a private company that focused specifically on hydroelectric development and which specialized in harnessing the powers of alpine rivers. Now, to do this, they were at this point building increasingly taller and more ambitious dams across several different valleys, constantly pushing the limits of engineering. Now, one of SADE's principal hydraulic engineers was called Carlo Semenza, and he was well known for particularly ambitious projects, including both arch and gravity dams, and he had a personal dream to one day create the tallest arch dam in the world. So, what's an arch dam then? Well, when engineers discuss different dam designs, they usually talk about the two main types, which are gravity dams and arch dams. Gravity dams rely on sheer mass to resist water pressure. Essentially, they use brute force to resist the push of the water by deploying massive blocks of concrete or masonry weighing tens of thousands of tons. And because of this, they are mostly used in broad valleys where there's room for a huge structure that can rest on firm rock. In contrast though, arch dams are far more elegant. Curving upstream, they instead press sideways into the canyon walls or abutments, taking advantage of the landscape itself to help contain the water. This makes arch dams much thinner and lighter, and it allows engineers to build taller structures using far less material. But they also only really work in those narrow, rocky gorges with strong abutments, meaning surrounding rocks. And Mr. Semenza's dream now involved creating an arch dam of unprecedented ambition. So he and his team set about carefully surveying Italy's alpine valleys, looking for the perfect location where this goal could be achieved. They evaluated rock strength, gorge narrowness, and hydroelectric potential, and that work eventually turned their attention to the Dolomites, a striking sub-range of the Southern Alps characterized by limestone peaks, vertical cliffs, and narrow twisting valleys. Specifically, they then focused on the Vajont Valley, a tributary of the Piave River, which offered exactly the kind of dramatic setting required for a high arch dam. Now, this gorge was exceptionally narrow, with steep limestone walls rising almost vertically from the river below. So its geology appeared favorable, with the projected abutment rock judged capable of withstanding the enormous lateral thrust of an arch dam. So this looked like it could be the perfect place to create a really massive dam. And so it was here, in this narrow alpine gorge, that Carlo Semenza eventually decided to build the Vajont Dam. But whilst that abutment rock might have been perfect, what about the rest of the landscape around, which comprised in large part of a mountain known as Monte Toc? Well, to visitors, Monte Toc looked solid and immovable, a permanent, never-changing part of the landscape, but it did have a bit of a reputation. Locals actually had another name for it. They called it the Walking Mountain. And that wasn't just a joke or folklore. No, that was because they had actually seen it move. For generations, people living in the valley had often observed subtle changes in the slope. Cracks would slowly open across farmland, stone walls would shift, trees would suddenly begin leaning, and after heavy rains, small landslides would sometimes spill down the mountainside. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to create some unease. Now, although the Sade engineers were aware of the fact that landslides had occurred in the wider region, that type of instability wasn't unusual in steep alpine terrain. And therefore, it was initially regarded just as local slope issues, not signs of a massive coherent instability, and therefore also not viewed as a catastrophic threat to the project. But deep beneath Monte Toc's surface, it turns out that its geology was far more complex than it first appeared. You see, the mountain itself was made of strong limestone layers, but those were then resting on weaker, clay-rich beds known as marl. And crucially, these clay layers formed long continuous plains, inclined down towards the valley in what geologists call a dip slope configuration, which is a geometry inherently susceptible to sliding, particularly if poor water pressure would rise. So what does that mean then? Well, when everything was nice and dry, these clay layers could support enormous weights and also hold it in place. But if they for whatever reason would become saturated with water, since they were confined between the stronger rock beds, these weaker layers could start acting as potential slip surfaces instead. And if water content would increase as well, that could also increase what the engineers refer to as the pore water pressure trapped inside of the rock mass. And that pressure would then press outward between the layers, reducing friction and weakening the bond holding the mountain in place. Basically, imagine a heavy block resting on a rough surface. As long as its weight presses down firmly onto the other surface, it will stay still. But if a fluid is forced in between the block and that surface, the friction will drop and the block becomes much easier to slide. And of course, the heavier the overlying mass of rock would be, the more dangerous that reduction in strength and friction will therefore become. Now, these characteristics didn't make a failure inevitable, but they did make this particular mountain sensitive to disturbances, and disturbances were coming. Despite the geological complexity of the surrounding site, the construction of the giant dam was eventually started back in 1957. It was a massive undertaking, with humongous amounts of concrete poured day after day into the narrow gorge. Over the following years, the arch of the magnificent construction rose steadily, climbing ever higher up against the limestone walls. But whilst that work went along according to plan, during the spring and summer of 1959, things had also begun to happen across the slopes of Monte Toc, with ground deformation becoming increasingly noticeable. Farmers and residents on the mountain reported cracks opening in fields and paths, doors and windows no longer closed properly, terraces deformed, trees tilted or shifted position, and in some cases fences and stone walls had even begun to misalign, with all of these changes obviously also being noticed by the Sade engineers. As a result of this, Carlo Semenza brought in his son, Eduardo Semenza, who was a young geologist, to complete a more detailed geological assessment of the area. His role would be limited to conducting geological fieldwork, like mapping the stratigraphy, identifying ancient landslide deposits, and evaluating slope stability. And around that same time, the company also installed a network of so-called survey markers. Now, these markers were simple but powerful tools. They usually comprised of small, unassuming metal bolts, pillars or stone discs who were set with precision into the landscape to create fixed reference points. Each of them established a stable position in a three-dimensional space, allowing engineers to repeatedly measure distance, angle and elevation using theodolites and optical instruments, which in turn enabled them to detect even millimeter-scale movements over time. And in this case, movements were soon detected. Initially, nothing happened suddenly. Instead, displacements were mapped and logged over weeks and months, and they all revealed a slow, continuing horizontal movement across the slope. At the same time, Eduardo had continued his geological investigations and had soon identified what appeared to be a scar of a vast prehistoric landslide in the area. The curved morphology of the slope and the disrupted bedding suggested that Monte Toc actually wasn't an intact mountainside at all, but instead the remnants from that previous massive landslide. And that was a critical scientific insight. Eduardo in fact concluded that the slope would potentially reactivate if it was destabilized by rising reservoir levels and the subsequent increasing pore water pressure. And he presented these findings internally to SADE's engineers and management as soon as he possibly could. But at the time he did this, his father Carlos' effective leadership role had greatly diminished. He eventually died in 1961, but Eduardo continued his work even after his father's death, and his early mapping is now considered one of the clearest missed warning signals in the entire Vajont case. But at the time, his warnings were not seen as significant enough to actually halt construction. Instead, the prevailing belief was that the mountainside was generally safe and that any potential movements would be gradual in nature. Because of that, it was also believed that it could also be monitored, managed and controlled. A classic example of human hubris in the face of lacking experience and knowledge. You see, whenever you come across unusual data, the very worst thing that you can do is to ignore it. But when it comes to our digital security, that's exactly what most of us do every single day. Take things like spam emails that seems to know just a little bit too much about you, or unexpected login attempts on your accounts, for example. That is exactly why I use NordVPN, today's sponsor, because Nord now encrypts my connection so that no one can follow what I'm doing online or where I am. Nord also has a fantastic security feature called the Threat Protection Pro, which actively scans websites I'm looking at in order to block anything that looks fishy. And that's especially important when you use public Wi-Fi like in airports, hotels or cafes. In those settings, your activity can be intercepted by absolutely anyone who is using that same network, but even on a private connection, data brokers are likely still tracking your searches and then selling that information on to whoever is willing to pay for it, which obviously will open you up to massive risks of identity theft, fraud or malware attacks. Now, Nord is the fastest VPN out there and also the only one independently verified by cybersecurity experts. And right now, you can grab 4 extra months for free when you sign up for their 2-year plan by scanning this QR code or by going to nordvpn.com/blackbox. Make sure you use that one. Also, remember that Nord always gives you a 30-day money-back guarantee, so you risk nothing by trying them out. Thank you so much, Nord, for making this new channel possible, and I really mean that. Very few companies would take a chance and support a new channel like this, so it's absolutely awesome. Thanks again. Now let's continue the story. By 1960, the Vajont Dam had soared to a breathtaking height of 261 meters above the sea, which meant that Carlos Emesa had achieved his goal. He had built one of the tallest dams in the world. Newspapers praised the achievement, politicians visited the site, and engineers from all around Europe studied its impressive design. To a lot of people, this represented the future, a triumph of human ingenuity over difficult terrain, as well as a symbol of Italian post-war modernity. But as it turns out, the terrain itself had other plans. Now, the process of actually filling the reservoir was not quick. It actually took several years, and as the water levels rose, the lake behind the dam expanded up the valley, soon pressing up against the base of Monte Toc. And unknown to everyone, that water then didn't stop at the surface. It soon also seeped deep into the mountain through cracks in the limestone, adding lubricating water to the clay layers inside, as well as increasing the pore water pressure. And that in turn now meant that the survey markers and monitoring instruments on the mountain continued to detect increasing shiftings of the terrain. The dam engineers continued to track this displacement carefully, measuring just how far different points of the slope shifted. And as they then plotted this movement against the reservoir water levels, a clear pattern soon seemed to emerge. As the water rose, the movement accelerated, and when the water level was lowered, movement seemed to slow down. So, this meant that it looked like Monte Toc wasn't static, but instead that it responded directly to changes in hydraulic load. And the engineers therefore interpreted this as a controllable system, where the outlets, which had been built into the dam's design, could effectively be used to control the water level and therefore also these movements. The problem was, though, that in reality, the water only drained slowly from the clay layers deep inside of the slope, so lowering the reservoir did reduce the pressure at the surface, but the pressure already trapped along the hidden slip planes in the mountain remained high, which reduced the effective stress along the clay layers, making the entire slope progressively easier to move. On top of this, the repeated filling and lowering of the reservoir levels likely also altered the internal stress balance inside of the mountain, with each cycle making the mountain weaker and more unstable. But from the outside and initially, this method did seem to be working. Lowering the water level often did reduce the rate of displacement, so the engineers continued to believe that this was something that was largely within their control. And while that might sound crazy now, it is important to remember here that sciences like slope stability modeling was still in its infancy here, so no one really knew exactly how this terrain would react. But everyone still assumed that if a landslide would occur, it would likely do so in stages, with a series of smaller slides happening over time, as nature historically had seemed to prefer gradual releases of tension. And if it happened like that, it would mean something manageable. Dangerous, of course, but it wouldn't threaten the whole reservoir or the dam. And that assumption would soon prove to be the most dangerous misunderstanding of all. As the years moved into the early 1960s, the movement on Monte Toc could soon no longer be dismissed as just a minor settling. It was clearly continuing to accelerate, and basically all inclinometers, survey markers and daily displacement readings documented a progressive creep. And not only that, markers across a large section of the slope were also moving at almost identical rates, and with that, some real concern started to grow. The engineers could clearly see the effects on the surface and had understood that the reservoir itself was playing a direct role here. They watched the cracks widen and the displacement accelerating, but they still only responded by lowering the water levels, since they hoped that this would permanently stabilize the slope. But of course, the terrifying reality here was that no matter what they did, the overall movement just continued in either a faster or a slower pace. And even worse, instead of acting as many small independent blocks, the mountain was behaving more like one enormous slab, now resting on a lubricated surface, which meant that once friction dropped below a critical threshold, nothing would be able to stop the entire mass from moving at once like a giant piston. And later that same year, as the reservoir filling process continued, a big landslide did occur. Around 700,000 cubic meters of rock suddenly slid off the mountain and into the reservoir, which represented a much larger section than anyone had previously anticipated. This produced a huge 10-meter high wave, but since the water level in the reservoir was well below its maximum, that wave was easily contained and therefore didn't cause any major damages. And that incident would prove to be significant because it clearly showed that the instability of Montauk was very real, and also that a much larger section could break off than had been previously calculated. Yet, paradoxically, because this 10-meter high wave had caused no serious threat, it now just reinforced the prevailing belief that slides would occur in manageable stages. Surely, this would have been the worst that it could do, right? Well, Italy then nationalized its electricity industry, and the private utility SADE was absorbed into the newly created state company, Enel. This meant that the control of the Vajont Dam project then formally passed on to them. But the mountain, of course, didn't stop moving with this change of control. Instead, it now seemed to be accelerating. Some monitoring stations had at this point started recording sudden surges, and others showed entire sections of the slope still moving almost as one single enormous unit. The mountain was clearly no longer just adjusting, it was reorganizing. Now, in hindsight, that coordinated movement was one of the clearest indicators that Montauk was not cracking in fragments, but instead preparing to move as one. But no one seemed to understand this. Then came 1963. By the middle of that year, many involved parties had accepted that some form of landslide was likely inevitable. So the question was now no longer if it would happen, it was how big and how fast would it be. The internal estimates varied. Some engineers estimated that it could be up to 20 million cubic meters of a potential slide, which would be dramatic for sure, but still manageable. Plans were discussed for potential wave impacts inside of the reservoir, which included the making of scale models that could show the way that a wave would propagate throughout the reservoir, and those studies suggested that a wave of perhaps 20 to 30 meters could be generated if a landslide was bad enough, which then became the reasoning behind keeping the reservoir level roughly 20 meters below the crest of the dam. But nothing would prepare the engineers for what was actually about to happen. By September of 1963, Montauk had now moved into its final phase. Displacements had accelerated sharply, which led to evacuation discussions for the people and equipment that was still left on those particular slope. But no full evacuation was ever ordered, since the engineers still believed that they were dealing with a controlled condition. And then came the 9th of October 1963. On that day, the reservoir was still not at its maximum level of 722.5 meters above the sea level. In the weeks before, the reservoir level had actually been drawn down and intentionally maintained at about 700.4 meters. Now, reservoir heights are always measured in meters above sea level, by the way, since the sea provides a consistent and universal reference point as opposed to the land's uneven and variable surfaces. And coming up to this day, the operators had really struggled to keep the water at or below this level. In fact, the total storage volume on the 9th of October had actually increased rather than decreased due to large inflows from the surrounding watershed, which exceeded what the outflows could release. But after some initial issues, the operators eventually managed to maintain the level at approximately 20 meters below the design crest, which was seen as more than an adequate safety margin. Now, this still meant that roughly 115 to 120 million cubic meters of water was trapped in the reservoir, which of course would be more than enough to become deadly if it was violently displaced, but that was seen as a pure impossibility. The problem was, though, that lately the slope down towards the reservoir from Montauk had been showing movements greater than anyone had ever seen before. Points that had once shifted millimeters per week were now moving centimeters per day, even approaching 20 centimeters per day in some places. And some stations were showing sudden bursts of motion as if entire sections of the mountain were slipping at once, which is consistent with something that is now known as tertiary creep behavior, the final accelerating phase preceding a catastrophic slope collapse. Now, the engineers had at this point understood that the slope was likely moving towards failure, but the primary response was still to focus on reservoir control, lower the water to reduce the pressure and then manage the effects of any landslides. With the hope still being that reducing water pressure would stabilize the clay layers and also slow the slide down. But at this point, the stress redistribution from this water drawdown likely had just made conditions even worse. So instead of stabilizing the mountain, parts of the slope now actually accelerated instead. And finally, at time 22:39 in the evening, it happened. The mountainside suddenly collapsed with a truly apocalyptic force, sending over 260 million cubic meters of rock crashing into the reservoir in only around 45 seconds. This meant that the slide moved with an astonishing speed of around 30 meters per second, or nearly 100 kilometers per hour, which was violent enough to register seismic activity at several measuring stations across Europe. As the mountainside crashed into the reservoir, it basically acted like a giant brick sliding into a bathtub, instantly creating something known as an impulse wave, where the water inside of the reservoir was now forced up and out of the way. So this wave now surged back up the valley, climbing high up the opposite sides, whilst another part rushed down straight towards the dam. Now, remember how the engineers had made sure that there was a 20-meter high margin from the water level up to the crest of the dam, just to make absolutely sure that whatever damage a landslide would cause could be contained within the dam? Well, that margin had seemed like plenty, since the last landslide, which remember had been much bigger than anyone thought possible, had only created a wave that was 10 meters high. But the cataclysm that had now occurred was more than 370 times bigger in terms of volume, or in other words, big enough to completely displace basically all of the water within the reservoir. So what was now heading down towards the dam was not a mere 10 or even 20 meters wave. No, this was an over 200 meter high mega tsunami, one of the biggest impulse waves ever recorded. The water surged up against the sides of the valley with an almost unbelievable force, uprooting trees, rocks and mud as it tumbled forward. But before getting to the actual dam, it would first reach several small villages located high up on the reservoir shores. The first one to be hit was the village of Casso, perched roughly 950 meters above the sea level, and it was violently struck as the water and debris surged up the mountainside to estimated heights of 250 meters above the reservoir level. Then came the nearby town of Erto, which was also situated along the reservoir shore, but luckily both of these towns were only slightly damaged by the wave, although they would later be evacuated out of pure precaution. But the villages further down, however, were not so lucky. At a pub in the village of Longarone, patrons had gathered to watch a European Cup match between Real Madrid and Glasgow Rangers. The evening had so far been quiet and ordinary, but of course, what no one knew was that millions of tons of water, debris and mud was now heading straight for the village, with the only thing protecting them being the newly constructed Vajont Dam. The tsunami hit the dam within seconds of the landslide, and incredibly, it actually withstood the enormous forces, which was a true statement to the engineering prowess of its builders. But unfortunately, that just didn't matter. The surge of the wave was so huge that the dam constituted little more than a speed bump at this point. So after having rolled over the summit, the mega tsunami just kept crushing down the Piave Valley, with an estimated 30 to 50 million cubic meters of water now following the terrain, splitting into multiple paths, funneling and accelerating in some parts, whilst spreading and lifting in others. And nothing in its path was spared. Now, there would be no real warning for the residents in the villages below. No crackling or vibrations, just a growing roar of something sounding like thunder for about a minute before the full calamity hit. Also, as the wave fell into the valley, it pushed and compressed an enormous amount of air in front of it, which soon hit the residents and buildings like a sudden hurricane from nowhere, impacting just seconds before the wave further increasing its damage. When the sludge finally hit, Houses were lifted from their foundations as if they were weightless. Stone buildings who had stood for centuries collapsed in moments, and bridges twisted apart like giant metal toys. Entire sections of the valley was erased, and Longarone, remember, where people had been watching football, was struck within just minutes of the landslide occurring, with some survivors later saying that water arrived so fast that it felt like the ground itself had exploded upwards under them. One described being lifted into the darkness, spinning violently and unable to tell where the sky was, and another remembered hearing walls shattering before he even realized that water had reached him. A surviving woman later said that she was thrown against debris so hard that she believed that she had died, only to wake up hours later partially buried in mud. Many of the survivors later said that there was just no time for fear, only confusion. The wave just swept through the town, tearing up everything in its path, and just as quickly as it had hit, it then moved on, and behind it, silence followed. Entire communities had vanished, with countless people left dead or missing. At time 2239, when the landslide happened, Longarone had been completely normal, whilst at time 2244, there was almost nothing left, with the same fate hitting several other villages down the valley as well. What now remained was just a mud-covered plain, scattered with fragments of homes, furniture, vehicles, and traces of what had once been people's lives. Whole families had disappeared in a single night, and some victims were never recovered. And above all of this, the Vajont Dam still stood, like the dark shadow of a bodyguard who had failed to do its job. The torrent had washed away parts of the masonry and parapet along the crest of the dam, and the roadway and railings along the top had also suffered some damage. But what was not damaged at all was the main concrete arch body, which remained structurally sound. The abutment and foundations were also not compromised in any way, so the dam itself stood almost unscathed, which obviously didn't matter at all. Nearly 2,000 people had died in the disaster, which included many of the staff that had been working in the vicinity of the dam and the reservoir when it happened. In the hours after the wave had passed, the rescue efforts began in near total silence. Survivors stumbled through mud and debris searching for family members. Soldiers and emergency crews arrived from the surrounding regions, but the scale of destruction downstream made any rescue work extremely difficult. As news of the disaster spread across Italy, the country was absolutely stunned. Early reports described it as a dam disaster, but when photographs revealed the massive concrete wall still standing, confusion just deepened. How could a dam failure destroy a valley when the dam itself remained intact? People desperately wanted answers, and the official investigation therefore began almost immediately. Engineers, geologists and government officials soon examined the site and studied the massive landslide scar on Monte Toc. And they also analyzed monitoring data collected in the years before the collapse, which helped reconstruct the sequence of events. Now, this collapse might have been a geological failure rather than a structural, but that didn't mean that the risk wasn't preventable. So, courts later ruled that the risk of catastrophic landslides had indeed been foreseeable, and in 1968 several officials and engineers were convicted. Not for building the dam, but for failing to properly respond to clear geological warnings and for continuing reservoir operations as the slope became increasingly unstable. It became obvious that officials and engineers had clearly known that Monte Toc showed signs of instability, and ancient landslide zones had been identified, with the role of water pressure in accelerating movement also clearly documented. The criminal convictions included multiple counts of manslaughter, negligent or culpable disaster, and various sentences were handed out, with the maximum being 6 years in prison. In any case, across Italy, the Vajont disaster soon became more than an engineering tragedy. It became a symbol, a warning about industrial ambition moving faster than the underlying understanding. And in the decades that followed, references to the Vajont disaster appeared whenever new infrastructure projects were debated. So it now basically entered public consciousness not just as a disaster, but as a lesson. And internationally, the case completely reshaped dam safety protocols. The Vajont disaster is actually still used today as a foundational case study in dam engineering and geotechnics across the world. So just like in my own field of aviation, tragedy here forced a fundamental shift in how dams were designed and operated worldwide. The dam itself still stands in the narrow canyon where it was built, but the reservoir behind it is gone, now largely filled with debris. And with that, the dam could no longer function as it was intended and was never put back into service. Life slowly returned to the valley, but the memory of that horrible night never really disappeared, which is also why we wanted to tell you this story. This disaster was not caused by a single villain, nor blind incompetence, and it wasn't nature striking without warning. No, it happened where human ambition met incomplete understanding, where progress moved faster than caution, and those are exactly the types of stories that you can continue to expect from this channel. Now, please make sure that you have subscribed, as we are now working to get this channel monetized to help pay for the production. Right now, that is done exclusively with the help of my wonderful Patreon crew, as well as my sponsor, NordVPN. So, a huge thank you to all of you. My name is Peter Hörnfeldt and you're watching Mentor's Black Box. Have an absolutely fantastic day and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.